The corridor was silent except for the shuffle of feet on concrete. Chris Watts was 17 seconds away from learning that in prison, cooperation with guards doesn't buy you safety. It buys you a target on your back. Two inmates stepped out of line. Their movement was coordinated, practiced, deliberate, and what happened in the next few seconds would send shockwaves through an entire cell block. But here's what you need to understand. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was an execution of judgment handed down by an organization that's been perfecting the art of prison justice for over 60 years. And Chris Watts? He never saw it coming. But before I show you what happened in that hallway, before I reveal the second incident that left him broken and terrified, before I expose the messages being sent through coded gestures and calculated brutality, you need to know three things. First, what Chris Watts did to end up on the Aryan Brotherhood's radar. Second, why the two warnings he received were actually acts of mercy in their twisted code. And third, what's happening right now in February 2026 that should terrify every single person watching this video. Because this isn't just about one hated inmate getting what some people think he deserves. This is about the complete collapse of state authority inside American prisons. This is about organized groups running facilities while guards stand by helpless. This is about a dangerous direction we're heading that nobody in power wants to acknowledge. This is True Crime Footnotes, and I'm an unsolved case analyst. But I'm not just doing this for content. I'm doing this because when I was growing up, I lost both of my parents to a crime that has never been solved. Their case sits somewhere in a filing cabinet, cold and forgotten. They never got justice. They never got their day in court. And that pain, that rage, that need for truth, it's what drives every single investigation I do. When I see cases like this, when I see the justice system failing, when I see the very institutions meant to deliver accountability becoming breeding grounds for organized criminal power, it triggers something deep inside me. Because if we can't maintain justice inside our own prisons, how can we expect justice for victims on the outside? How can families like mine ever hope for resolution? So I dig. I spend thousands of dollars on prison records that should be public but somehow cost a fortune to access. I file requests for court documents that take months to arrive. I track down sources who don't want to talk. I piece together timelines from fragments of information. And I do it because someone has to. Someone has to expose what's really happening behind those walls. If you believe my parents deserve justice, if you believe every victim deserves their story told, type Amen in the comments right now. Let me know this work matters. Let me know I'm not fighting alone. Now let me show you what they don't want you to see. August 13th, 2018. The name Chris Watts entered the American consciousness in the worst possible way. His pregnant wife Sean-Ann. His daughters Bella, 4 years old, and Celeste, 3 years old. Gone. And Chris went on television playing the concerned husband, the worried father, begging for their safe return. But the mask crumbled fast. Within 48 hours, investigators knew. Within a week, the world knew. Sean-Ann was found in a shallow grave on the oil field where Chris worked. And his daughters, those two little girls who called him Daddy, who trusted him completely, who had no idea what was coming, they were found stuffed into oil tanks. Crude oil tanks. Discarded like garbage. Hidden like evidence. The details that came out during interrogation were so disturbing that even veteran homicide detectives had to step away from the interview room. The premeditation. The coldness. The fact that he loaded their bodies into his truck and drove to that oil field while texting his mistress about their future together. The fact that little Bella watched him do something terrible to her mother and sister and asked, "Is the same thing going to happen to me, Daddy?" He got 5 life sentences. No possibility of parole. And the judge made it clear, you will die in prison. You will never breathe free air again. You will carry the weight of what you did until your last breath. Colorado wanted him buried in their system. Hidden away. Forgotten. But death threats started immediately. Inmates in Colorado facilities knew about the case. Some of them had daughters the same age as Bella and Celeste. Some of them had committed terrible crimes themselves, but still recognized a line they'd never cross. And Chris Watts had obliterated that line. He'd gone so far beyond it that even hardened criminals wanted him eliminated. So in December 2018, the Colorado Department of Corrections made a decision. Transfer him. Get him out of state. Send him somewhere far from the community that knew his victims. Somewhere he could serve his sentence without constant threats. Somewhere he might actually survive. They sent him to Wisconsin. Dodge Correctional Institution. Maximum security. The thinking was simple. Distance equals safety. New facility equals fresh start. Put him in a place where inmates don't have personal connections to his crimes. Where he's just another lifer. Where he can fade into the background. But here's what they didn't understand about prison communication networks. Information doesn't travel through official channels. It travels through a system that's older, more efficient, and completely invisible to authorities. Within 2 weeks of Chris Watts arriving in Wisconsin, every single inmate in that facility knew exactly who he was. They knew what he did. They knew the details. They knew he was hated. And in prison, there's a hierarchy. At the very top are the organized groups, the gangs that control territory, economics, and violence. In the middle are regular inmates trying to serve their time without trouble. And at the very bottom, beneath everyone else, are the predators who hurt children. That's the unforgivable category. The ones who even murderers look down on. The ones who exist in prison at the mercy of everyone else. Chris Watts landed at the absolute bottom. And he knew it. So he did what a lot of vulnerable inmates do. He tried to find protection through compliance. He followed every rule. He volunteered for work details. He attended chapel services. He kept his head down and his mouth shut. He made himself useful to the guards, helpful to the staff, cooperative with the system. And for a while it worked. The organized groups left him alone. Not because they didn't know who he was. Not because they didn't despise him, but because he wasn't worth the attention. He was just another piece of human garbage trying to survive. Invisible. Irrelevant. Safe. But then Chris Watts made a catastrophic mistake. He started talking to the guards about what he was seeing in the cell block. Little observations. Small details. Comments about tensions between inmates. Notes about who was spending time with who. He thought he was being smart, building relationships with staff that might protect him, earning favor that might translate to better treatment. What he didn't realize was that every single one of those conversations was being watched. And the people watching weren't guards. Let me tell you about the Aryan Brotherhood. Because if you don't understand who they are, you can't understand what happened to Chris Watts. And more importantly, you can't understand the terrifying reality of who actually runs American prisons. San Quentin State Prison, 1964. A group of white inmates formed a protection organization. They claimed it was defensive, a response to other racial gangs organizing in the system. They called themselves the Aryan Brotherhood, the brand, the AB. And in those early years, maybe it was about protection. Maybe it started with good intentions in a violent environment, but it evolved into something far darker. By the 1970s, they'd spread to facilities across California and beyond. By the 1980s, they controlled drug trafficking, extortion, and contract violence in prisons nationwide. By the 1990s, federal prosecutors estimated they made up less than 1% of the total prison population but were responsible for over 26% of all prison murders. Think about that ratio. Less than 1%. Over a quarter of the killings. That's not random violence. That's organizational efficiency. That's strategic dominance. That's a criminal enterprise operating with military precision inside institutions the government claims to control. The AB operates on blood in, blood out. You commit an act of violence to join. You die before you leave. There's no retirement. No resignation. You're a member for life, whether that life lasts 30 years or 30 days. They have a command structure. Shot callers who make strategic decisions. Soldiers who execute orders. Associates who provide support without full membership. And they communicate through coded letters, through artwork, through gestures and phrases that guards hear but don't understand. But here's the part that should keep you up at night. The Aryan Brotherhood isn't just a prison gang. They have extensive operations outside. Drug networks, arms trafficking, money laundering, contract hits. When a member gets released, they don't retire to a quiet life. They become external operatives. They expand the empire beyond the walls. And they maintain connections with members still inside through a system of couriers, coded messages, and family visits that corrections staff can monitor but can't prevent. And the violence? It's not emotional. It's not rage. It's business. It's enforcement of a code that's been refined over 6 decades. When someone violates AB rules, the response is calculated, proportional, designed to send a message not just to the target but to everyone watching. And everyone is always watching. At Dodge Correctional in Wisconsin, the AB presence wasn't massive. Maybe a dozen full members. Another 20 or 30 associates. But in a facility of a few thousand inmates, that's more than enough. More than enough to control entire cell blocks. More than enough to enforce their code. More than enough to decide who lives comfortably and who lives in fear. And when Chris Watts arrived, they noticed. They knew who he was. They knew what he'd done. They knew he was hated. But initially, they left him alone. Why? Because touching him too soon would draw attention, would bring investigations, would disrupt their operations. Better to watch, to wait, to see if he'd give them a reason that justified the risk. And Chris Watts gave them that reason. He started building relationships with staff. Casual conversations, helpful observations, little comments about tension in the unit, about inmates acting strangely, about dynamics that seemed off. To Chris, this was survival strategy. To the AB, this was snitching. In prison culture, there's no crime worse than being a snitch. Not murder, not theft, not assault. Snitching, cooperating with authorities, providing information that could harm other inmates. That's the unforgivable sin. That's the violation that demands correction. And correction in prison doesn't come from a disciplinary committee. It comes from the people whose code you violated. By mid-2025, the AB had seen enough. Chris Watts needed to be educated. And they decided to handle it the old-fashioned way. With a warning first. Then escalation if the warning was ignored. Then consequences if escalation didn't work. Standard protocol for dealing with someone who doesn't understand the rules. What Chris Watts didn't realize was that the AB was showing him mercy. The fact that they warned him at all instead of just handling it immediately? That was a courtesy extended to almost no one. And he was about to waste it. Before I tell you what happened during that yard time warning, I need to know something from you. Do you think Chris Watts deserves protection in prison? Should the state guarantee his safety even though he destroyed his own family? Or is what's happening to him just natural consequences in an environment where his crimes make him a target? Drop your answer in the comments. No judgment. I genuinely want to know where you stand on this because it's more complicated than it seems. And trust me, it's about to get even more complicated. Comment now before the next part because you won't want to pause once this timeline starts moving. Mid-2025. Summer in Wisconsin. The kind of heat that makes concrete shimmer and turns the prison yard into an oven. Yard time was one of the few freedoms inmates had. A couple hours outside the cell. Space to move. Fresh air that didn't smell like disinfectant and desperation. Chris Watts had a routine. He walked the perimeter. Alone. Didn't join groups. Didn't play cards or basketball. Just walked in circles like he was trying to outpace his own thoughts. Lap after lap. Head down. Hands behind his back. Invisible. And then 3 men stepped into his path. Not aggressively. Not blocking him in an obvious way. Just standing there. Waiting. Their presence was deliberate. Their positioning calculated. The guards in the towers could see the interaction but couldn't hear the words. It looked like a casual conversation. Three inmates talking to a fourth. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth intervening over. But the words being spoken were anything but casual. They told Chris they'd noticed something. His conversations with staff. The way he volunteered information. The observations he made during count. The questions he asked during work duty. They told him they understood he was trying to survive. That he was trying to build relationships that might protect him. But that strategy, in this environment, that was called snitching. And snitching had consequences. They used a phrase, keep family business in the family. Everything that happens in the block stays in the block. You don't share it with guards. You don't volunteer observations to staff. You don't try to buy safety by selling information. You keep your mouth shut. Your eyes down. Your ears closed. That's how you survive. The tone wasn't loud. Wasn't threatening in a way that would attract guard attention. Just firm. Direct. Unambiguous. They gave him eye contact that lasted 3 seconds too long. They positioned themselves just close enough to be physically intimidating without making contact. And then they stepped aside. Conversation over. Message delivered. Chris Watts nodded. Mumbled something about understanding. Stepped around them and continued walking. But his pace was faster now. His posture more rigid. His eyes actively avoiding contact with anyone. The rest of yard time, he stayed on the far side. Away from groups. Away from attention. Processing what had just happened. The guards watching from above saw the whole thing. Brief interaction. No violence. No raised voices. Probably just prison social dynamics. New inmates learning the hierarchy. Nothing to report. Nothing to document. Just another day. But what the guards didn't see was what happened after. One of the three men made a subtle gesture to others in the cell block when they returned inside. A nod. A signal that meant the warning was delivered. Now they'd watch. They'd monitor. They'd see if Chris Watts was smart enough to listen. For about 3 weeks, it seemed like he was. His conversations with staff became brief. Purely functional. No extra words. No volunteered information. He worked his job in the laundry facility without comment. He attended chapel without talking to anyone. He read in his cell during free time. Model behavior. Quiet. Compliant. Smart. But then the slipping started. Slowly. Subtly. A comment here about tensions in the day room. An observation there about inmates acting differently around count time. A question to a guard about why certain people were being moved to different cells. Nothing that sounded like traditional snitching. Nothing overt. Just small breaches. Little violations of the code he'd been told to follow. And in prison, there are no small violations. Everything matters. Every word gets noticed. Every gesture gets analyzed. And Chris Watts was being watched more closely than he realized. By late 2025, the patience was wearing thin. The AB leadership had given him a chance. They'd warned him clearly. They'd explained the rules. And he'd nodded and agreed and then gone right back to his old behavior. That kind of disrespect couldn't stand. That kind of defiance demanded correction. Not for revenge. Not for punishment. But for maintenance of order. For preservation of the code. For sending a message to every other inmate watching. The rules apply to everyone. A decision was made. No dramatic meeting. No ceremony. Just a quiet conversation between shot callers during rec time. A nod of agreement. A timeline established. Chris Watts would be corrected. Physically. Publicly. Definitively. The question wasn't if. It was when. And how hard. The planning was meticulous. They studied his routine. His movements. His schedule. They identified the best opportunity. Maximum impact. Minimum guard interference. Minimal camera coverage. They assigned roles. 2 soldiers to execute. Others to watch the perimeter. Others to create distraction if needed. This wasn't going to be sloppy. This was going to be professional. And Chris Watts had no idea it was coming. January 2026. Cold had settled into Wisconsin with a brutality that matched the environment inside Dodge Correctional. Heating was inconsistent. Hot water was rationed. Inmates moved through their days hunched against a chill that seemed to seep from the concrete itself. It was lunchtime. Standard movement. Inmates from multiple cell blocks being herded toward the chow hall. Single file down narrow corridors. Guards positioned at intervals. Cameras covering major intersections. Everything by protocol. Everything controlled. Everything safe. Chris Watts was in the middle of the line. Not too close to the front where he'd be visible. Not dragging at the back where he'd be isolated. Just another orange jumpsuit in a river of orange jumpsuits. The corridor was poorly lit. Fluorescent tubes overhead, half of them flickering. The sound of shuffling feet echoed off concrete walls. Coughs. Murmurs. The normal soundtrack of institutional movement. And then everything changed. 2 inmates stepped in close. The choreography was perfect. One from behind. One from the side. The first shove came without warning. Chris's shoulder hit the wall hard enough to make a sound that echoed down the corridor. Before he could process what was happening, before his brain could shift from routine to emergency, the second strike came. A fist to the ribs. Precise. Controlled. Not a wild haymaker. A targeted shot placed exactly where it would hurt without causing visible injury that would demand emergency intervention. Chris tried to cover up. Tried to protect his head. But they weren't aiming for his head. They were aiming for body mass. For places that bruise deep. For pain that lasts weeks. Another strike. Ribs again. Then a kidney shot that sent lightning through his nervous system. His legs buckled. He started going down. A knee came up and caught him in the thigh. Not hard enough to break bone. Just hard enough to reinforce the message. The entire attack lasted maybe 12 seconds. 15 at most. By the time guards started moving toward the commotion, the 2 attackers had already stepped back into line. Hands visible. No aggressive posture. No weapons. Just 2 guys walking to lunch like nothing had happened. And Chris Watts was on the ground, curled into a ball, gasping for air. Guards pulled him from the line. Standard protocol. They moved him to a holding area away from the general population. They did a visual assessment. Bruising on the ribs. Already starting to show. Swelling on the shoulder. His breathing was shallow but steady. No broken bones visible. No cuts. No bleeding. No need for outside hospital transport. Just trauma. Just pain. Just fear. They asked what happened. Who did this? Did he see their faces? Could he identify them? And Chris gave them the answer he'd been expected to give. He slipped. Got pushed by accident in the crowded corridor. Too many people trying to move too fast. Happened so quick he didn't see who. Just an accident. Just bad luck. He'd be fine. Just needed to catch his breath. The guards knew it was a lie. They'd seen the attack on the cameras, though the angle was bad and the lighting worse. They knew this was targeted. They knew this was a message. But without victim cooperation, without clear video evidence identifying the attackers, without witnesses willing to testify, there was nothing they could prosecute. So they documented it. They flagged his file. They noted increased monitoring needed. And after 2 hours in the holding cell, they sent him back to general population. Because protective custody wasn't an option. The segregation unit was full. Overcrowding had reached critical levels across the facility. Every bed was occupied. Every cell was maxed. And Chris Watts, despite the attack, despite the obvious danger, didn't qualify for the limited protection slots available. He'd claimed it was an accident. He'd refused to cooperate. So back to the block he went. And when he walked back through those doors, when he limped to his cell with visible bruising and careful movements, every inmate in that unit knew. The AB had sent their message. The correction had been delivered. And Chris Watts now understood what his cooperation with staff had bought him. Not safety. Not protection. Not favor. Just pain. For about a week, he was a ghost. Spoke to no one. Attended nothing optional. Sat in his cell during free time staring at walls. Ate alone. Moved through the facility like a man who'd seen his own mortality and didn't like the view. The AB watched him. Watched for compliance. Watched for changed behavior. Watched to see if the lesson had been learned. But then something happened that surprised them. Something they hadn't anticipated. Chris Watts started talking again. Not to inmates. Never to inmates. But to staff. Quiet conversations during cell checks. Hushed words during work duty. And the content of those conversations, filtered back through the prison communication network that always finds a way, was troubling. He was asking about transfers. About protective options. About what it would take to get moved to a different facility. And worse, he was still making observations. Still noting tensions. Still volunteering information about dynamics in the unit. He was trying to leverage what he knew to buy his way out. He was still snitching. And this time, the response would be final. You know, getting this information wasn't easy. Prison records cost me over $800 for this case alone. Court documents that should be public took 3 months and 2 denied requests to access. I've spent countless hours tracking down sources, verifying timelines, cross-referencing incident reports. There are nights I want to quit. Nights I question whether anyone actually cares about the truth when it's this hard to find. But then I remember my parents. I remember that their case is still cold because nobody kept digging. Nobody kept pushing. Nobody refused to quit. And I think about all the other families out there waiting for answers. So I don't quit. I won't quit. But I can't do this alone. If this work matters to you, you know what button to press. January 28, 2026. Less than 2 weeks after the corridor attack. The day room during recreation period. This was supposed to be the safest time. Guards present. Multiple inmates around. Cameras covering every angle. Activity and noise that made coordinated violence difficult. Supposed to be safe. Chris Watts was sitting at a table near the back. Alone as always. He'd brought a book from the library. Some religious text about redemption and grace. Appropriate reading for a man whose crimes had put him beyond both. He wasn't really reading. Just staring at pages. Pretending to be absorbed. Trying to be invisible. Trying to disappear into the background noise of card games and television and conversation. He didn't notice them approaching until they were already there. 5 men this time. Not 2. 5. They surrounded the table. No words. No announcement. No warning. Just sudden presence. Overwhelming presence. Threatening presence. The first one grabbed him by the collar and yanked him up. The book fell. Pages fluttered. Hit the floor. Before Chris could scream, before he could call for help, a hand clamped over his mouth. They dragged him. Not far. Just to the corner. Away from the main camera angle. Into a blind spot that had been mapped and memorized and was now being exploited. And then the beating started. This wasn't controlled like the corridor. This wasn't measured. This was punishment. This was fury. This was a message being delivered with maximum force. Fists from every direction. Body shots. Leg shots. A kick to the knee that sent him crashing down. More strikes to the ribs. To the back. To places already bruised from the first attack. They were targeting old injuries. Maximizing pain. Breaking him not just physically but mentally. It went on for longer than the first attack. 20 seconds. Maybe 25. Long enough that other inmates stopped what they were doing and turned away. Long enough that the noise level in the day room dropped. Long enough that the change in atmosphere alerted the guards that something was wrong. By the time staff reached the corner, by the time they started pulling people apart, the attackers had already melted back into the general population. Dispersed. Disappeared. Anonymous. And Chris Watts was on the floor. Not moving. Not speaking. Just lying there in a fetal position. Shaking. Broken. The guards called for medical. They secured the area. They started trying to identify who was involved. But in a room with 30 inmates and 2 guards and a blind spot that had been deliberately exploited, finding clear evidence was nearly impossible. Medical staff arrived. They assessed him on scene. Multiple areas of bruising. Swelling across the torso. Possible cracked ribs. He was conscious but unresponsive to questions. In shock. They moved him to the facility's medical observation unit. Not a hospital transfer. Just extended monitoring within the prison itself. They documented everything with photos and notes. Evidence for an investigation that would likely go nowhere. And then, against all logic, against all common sense, they sent him back to the same housing unit. Not because staff thought it was safe. Not because they believed the threat had passed. But because there was literally nowhere else to put him. Protective custody was full. Transfer requests took weeks to process. And frankly, from an institutional perspective, Chris Watts wasn't a priority. He was a child-harming offender with multiple life sentences. If he got roughed up in prison, the thinking went, maybe that was just the price he paid for what he did. So back he went. Through those doors. Into that cell block. Past inmates who knew exactly what had happened and why. Past AB members who gave him looks that said everything. Past a power structure that had made its position crystal clear. And this time when he reached his cell, when he sat on that bunk and looked at those walls, Chris Watts understood something fundamental. He'd crossed a line. He'd violated a code. And there were no more warnings coming. The next time, if there was a next time, it wouldn't be fists. It would be something permanent. Early February 2026. If you could see Chris Watts now, you wouldn't recognize him as the man who walked into Dodge Correctional thinking he could navigate the system through cooperation. That man is gone. What remains is someone who exists in a state of constant hypervigilance. Constant fear. Constant awareness that his life continues only at the pleasure of people who despise him. His morning routine starts before count. He's awake. Ready. Standing at his cell door with hands visible before the guards even reach his section. Eyes down. No conversation. No requests. Just compliance. Perfect, terrified compliance. During movements, he positions himself in the middle of groups. Never first where he'd be visible. Never last where he'd be isolated. Surrounded by other inmates who don't acknowledge his existence. He's learned that isolation is dangerous. But so is standing out. So he exists in that strange middle space, trying to be present but forgettable, trying to breathe without drawing attention to the act. Work duty in the laundry facility. He performs every task with mechanical precision. Folds. Sorts. Loads. Unloads. No breaks. No conversation. No eye contact. The guards have noticed the change. They see the fear in his body language. They see how he flinches when someone approaches too quickly. They see how he moves through space like a prey animal in a predator's territory. And they know they can't fix it. Chapel attendance continues. It's one of the few places he feels marginally safe. The chaplain doesn't judge. Doesn't ask questions. Just provides space for whatever passes for hope in a place like this. Chris sits in the back row. Head bowed. Hands folded. Whether he's praying or hiding, nobody knows. Maybe both. But the most dramatic change is in his interactions with staff. They've stopped. Completely. Totally. Absolutely. When guards speak to him, he responds in monosyllables. Yes. No. Understood. That's it. No observations. The Chris Watts story is a microcosm. One man. One facility. 2 beatings. But multiply that by thousands happening right now across America and you start to see the scope of this crisis. Real talk. If you were in Chris Watts' position right now, what would you do? Would you request a transfer knowing it might take months and you're vulnerable every day until it happens? Would you try for protective custody even though it means 23-hour lockdown in a cell the size of a bathroom? Would you just accept this as your reality and try to survive one day at a time? Or would you risk talking to authorities one more time knowing what happened the last 2 times you did? Drop your honest answer in the comments. No judgment. Because I genuinely want to know how you'd navigate an impossible situation where every option seems like the wrong one.